This is the Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 14th chapter. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side of the Sea of Galilee while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." And so Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the gospel of the Lord. You may have heard this story before. It's a pretty popular one. A lot of preachers will read this story and they will talk about Peter and his lack of faith. Because, he didn't really make it that far before he started to sink. When Peter got out of that boat and he started to walk on the water, he was fine when he was walking toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong winds around him, he became frightened and he began to sink. And then he had to cry out to Jesus for help. Then Jesus pulls him up and says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" A lot of preachers will read this story and they'll talk about how we need to keep our eyes on Jesus, not on the things that make us doubt, so that we don't sink in the storms of our lives. Now, first of all, I always think that Peter should get more credit for having the faith to get out of that boat and trying to walk on the water in the first place. And second, we know that we have a God of love and grace. When Peter got scared, does anyone really think that Jesus was going to just keep walking, like let Peter sink, or even just swim back to the boat on his own? So I'm not going to talk about Peter and his perceived lack of faith in this story. We all know that we have times when we feel like there's a storm or strong winds going on around us. And we all have times when we feel like we are sinking because of the stresses or the pain or the exhaustion that we are experiencing. I'm guessing that a lot of you can say you are experiencing a stormy or windy or sinking time right now. But loved children of God, no matter what is happening in our world or in our lives, sinking is never an option for us. Jesus always pulls us up. We have that promise because of what Jesus did on the cross and in the empty tomb. This whole story, it starts with Jesus taking some time to himself. The first verse I read says, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side of the sea while he dismissed the crowds. After he dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. Now, Jesus had just fed that huge crowd of people, over 5,000 people. So it would make sense that he needed a break, wanted some rest, time to pray. So the disciples are out on the boat, out on the sea, and it's windy, kind of stormy wind. But Jesus doesn't hang out on the shore waiting for them to come back. He decides to go to them. So he goes walking toward them on the sea. The disciples see him and they freak out because they think they are seeing a ghost, which makes total sense because seeing a man walking on the water isn't something that happens all the time, obviously. But Jesus tells them not to be afraid. And then in the story, Peter does his thing. We already talked about that a little bit. He got out, walked on the water for a little, sank, Jesus pulled them up. Then they both got into the boat with all the others, and the wind stopped. And then the disciples, we are told, worshiped Jesus, saying that he was the Son of God. Perhaps the best part of the story for us to hear right now is the part where Jesus walked on the water. I know it doesn't really seem like a big deal for us to hear that today. We know that the man conquered death, he rose from the dead. The fact that Jesus can walk on water doesn't really seem like a big deal to us, since we know the rest of the story. So let's not focus necessarily on the walking on the water part, but let's focus on what Jesus is doing when he's walking on the water. He is going to the disciples. He's going to them. He didn't have to do that. Think about it. Jesus was probably enjoying his alone time on that mountain. He was probably tired. He could have used some more rest. He could have had some more time to himself before they all came back to shore. He could have waited for them to come to him. But he decided to go over the water, through the wind, enter that stormy wind, to go to them. That's the best part for us to hear. We have a God who comes to us. We have a God who comes to us. God came to us in Jesus Christ. God lived among us, died among us, rose from the dead among us, and promises to continue to be with us. I think that might be the most important thing for us to hear today. We have a God who comes to us. God comes to us into the storms of our lives and into the sunshiny days too, of course. But on the rainy, cloudy, messy days of life, God is there. No matter how bad things get, God is with you. No matter how awesome things are, God is with you. Now, I know most of you know that, and I hope you can live it as truth in your lives. Because when we live our lives knowing God is with us, maybe it can give us a bit more courage to love our neighbors. And when we live our lives knowing God is with us, maybe it can give us the strength we need to get out of bed in the morning. When we live our lives knowing God is with us, maybe we can truly understand that it has nothing to do with us trying to walk on the water, and it has everything to do with Jesus reaching out to pull us up. Amen.